Okay, so de Beauvoir is trying to argue here that the fact of being a woman affects our lives. In order to undermine oppression, women must become subjects to change the social ontology that is at the basis of the way in which we form our identities. Ontology means the study of being, categories of being. What is it to be? What is it to be a woman? And the fact that being a woman is at the very basis of the way in which we form our identities, who we are, what kind of agency we exercise, to what degree we internalize oppression. We need to change our social ontology in order to undermine gender oppression. In the introduction to this text, Beauvoir asks an absolutely groundbreaking question that no one has asked before. Beauvoir asks, what is a woman? This question is groundbreaking because nobody ever asks this question about man. Nobody asks, what is man? We know what man is. Man has been discussed in every book of fiction, in every book of literature, in every philosophy text, in every legal policy, in the Constitution. We know what man is. Man is just what it is to be a human person. A woman must define herself as a woman. Men don't have to define themselves as men. They're just persons. For example, you might hear oftentimes what Marilyn Frye has called marked. Women are often marked in a particular way. That is, your dad might be a doctor or a lawyer or an astronaut, but if your mom is a doctor or a lawyer or an astronaut, it's more than likely said of her at one time or another that she is a female doctor or a female lawyer or a female astronaut. Women have to define themselves as women, whereas men are just people. They're neutral. So humanity is essentially male, and humanity defines women as relative to men, as inferior to men. And as Beauvoir notes, there's a great deal of this throughout our cultural history. Just in philosophy, she notes that the history of philosophy is rife with male philosophers claiming that women are inferior to men, from Plato and Aristotle to St. Thomas, Aquinas, Augustine, and Kant. But not all females are women. Around the mid-20th century, when Beauvoir was writing this text, there was a lot of discussion about how femininity was in danger. If you picked up the magazines, there were worries that women were becoming less feminine. They were getting maybe part-time jobs or wearing trousers instead of skirts. So there was this discussion of how femininity was in danger. But as Beauvoir says, if femininity is in danger, then being a woman is not some essential feature of females. It's an arbitrary designation. Beauvoir gives us her most famous quote when she says, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman." Only the intervention of someone else can establish any individual as other. So one is not born a woman. Becoming a woman is something that happens to you by someone else. Someone recognizes women as others and thus places them in that side of the binary gender dichotomy. Some feminists, liberal feminists, respond to this issue by claiming that there are two categories of human beings. There are men and there are women. And all people, both men and women, should be considered human. But women simply are not men. Beauvoir and others are going to have an issue with this kind of liberal approach that really seeks equality among humans and this notion that we're all the same. Because the fact is we're not all the same. This feminist approach that seeks to undermine oppression from the perspective of equality suppresses differences among men and women. Yet, in society, man is seen as neutral and positive, representing humanity and all of its infinite possibility and creativity and wonder. And woman is seen as negative, as other, as inessential. If we deny the conditions under which we become other, we cannot see the problem. This is what Beauvoir is getting at when she says we have to change our understanding of social ontology. If we don't look at our social ontology, at the way in which we understand our very being as women, then we can't see the problem, because that's where the problem lies. The problem of women lies in the fact that we are made as other. We become other. We're not born already essentially naturally inferior, essentially naturally other. We become other by being othered. So other is a primordial category. And problems of gender and sexuality are at the basis. They are deeply embedded in our identity as persons, as selves. And the history of consciousness formation shows that there must be a boundaried self, that I can distinguish myself as different from you. This is recognition theory, particularly in Hegel. What is it to be a self and to recognize someone else as separate from me? I'm here, you're over there. I'm a self, you're an other. This duality, self and other, was not originally empirical. It did not attach to the division of the sexes. Historically, though, socially, socio-historically, men became essential and women became inessential. Men became selves and women became others. So this implies that the liberal approach of shifting resources so that we're all treated equally, that we all have equal access to resources, is not enough. Gender oppression is rooted in the very formation of our identities. When I am a self and I recognize someone else as other, yet that other does not recognize me as a self, and I constantly internalize the fact that I am other, I become other. I identify as other rather than as a subject. So even the most mediocre of males, Beauvoir says, believes himself to be a demigod compared with women. Men profit in many, many ways from the otherness and the alterity of women. Sympathetic men might admit that women are equal or ought to be treated equally to men, but at the same time, they cannot be equal to men because they can't serve in the same professions or they're not capable of the same depth of reason. So even the most sympathetic of men who on the one hand want to admit that women ought to be treated equally will turn around and have some kind of essentialist claim as to why women in fact aren't the same as men. They're not as strong, they're not as aggressive, they're not as rational, right? That there's something essential about women that makes them inferior. But what Beauvoir is trying to argue is that basically that's bullshit. That is a social becoming that has been put on women. One is not born a woman, one is not born other, but rather one becomes a woman. One is othered by men. Why, Beauvoir asks, do women remain submissive? We have been put into the role of other. Why do we remain there? Why do we accept that? Why do women accept an alien, submissive point of view? Why do women not dispute male sovereignty? She's going to claim that it's not due to inequality of number. We are not a minority. Unlike other oppressed groups, we actually have roughly the same population as males. Minority issues have historical events. There's a history prior to colonialism. There's a history prior to slavery. There's a history prior to the growth of the proletariat. There's not a history prior to women. The other, though, is cast as other by the subject. Women are cast as other by men. And submission, Beauvoir argues, comes from the fact that women haven't changed it. The social ontology of women must be changed. We have to dig all the way down to the core of our identity, the way that we understand ourselves as selves, and refuse to be seen as other. We have to embrace our subjectivity and refuse to internalize our otherness, which requires a great deal of awareness and attention to those social and cultural relationships and systems and networks that other and oppress women. So on Beauvoir's view, she thinks the liberal feminists have it wrong. There's nothing that equal resources can do to help us. Even if we had equal resources, we could still be oppressed because we would still be cast in the role of other. So she thinks women must do something. This is a kind of battle cry here. Women must do something. But many women are comfortable in their role as other. Declining to be in the appropriate social role means you take yourself away from power and privilege that comes along with that role. So refusing to stay in that feminine submissive role means that you take yourself away from the kind of economic and political power and resources that you're accustomed to. And this is why many women are comfortable in their role as other. Oh, that's what I want to do. I want to be a housewife. It makes me happy. This kind of thing. That may be true. It may make you happy. But Beauvoir's point is that women will never be autonomous subjects so long as they accept the role of otherness. On Beauvoir's view, we have to agitate. We have to agitate, and not merely symbolically. We have to agitate significantly in ways that will create change at the ontological level, at the level of our very being, at the level of our very subject formation. And our subject formation is how we see the world, how we perceive the world. How do we agitate without power? How do we agitate without resources? How do we agitate without solidarity? We could never really be separatists because we would need the resources of men. Women are different from other minorities. Women lack means of organizing, we lack solidarity, we lack community. We're not segregated. We can't be separatists. Contra the claims of the second wave radical feminists. Women have taken only what men have been willing to give us. And the bond uniting women to our oppressors is unique. The division of the sexes is a biological fact, according to Beauvoir, not an historical event. We will challenge this idea. Although it's interesting, although Beauvoir is challenging essentialism, be aware that what she's challenging here is gender essentialism. That there's something essential about being a woman, or there's something essential about being a man. That women are essentially weaker, irrational. That women are essentially weak, irrational, inessential. That men are essentially strong, rational human beings. She is challenging the fact that gender is real in that way. However, on Beauvoir's view, she does claim that the division of sexes is a biological fact, not a historical event. So she's leaving a kind of essentialism in place. That is, that there are two distinct categories of biological sex, male and female. So gender is masculine, feminine, or man and woman, whereas biological sex is understood to be maleness and femaleness. And on Beauvoir's view, she's not challenging the fact that maleness and femaleness is natural, essential, inherent. We'll challenge that view in future readings, though. Now, Beauvoir asks, do women really want liberation? Do we really want to be liberated? Do we really want to be subjects? Do we really want to be autonomous? Do we really want to be free? Do we really want to transcend the situations that we find ourselves in? If we do, Beauvoir says, women must give up their privileges. Women must become subjects. They must refuse to be cast as other. How is it that the world has always belonged to men and that things have begun to change only recently? Beauvoir says, look, these naturalist kind of accounts of what it is to be a woman exemplify a vicious circle. When an individual is kept in a situation of inferiority, he is in fact inferior, where is means to become. So to say that women are inferior is not to say that they are essentially inferior, though it is to say that they are in a they have become inferior through a situation of oppression. There's a tension between existential choice and transcendence and becoming inferior. Internalizing beliefs, saying something is inside me as a static identity, is different than having fewer possibilities, which is a condition of the environment I'm in. Beauvoir gives the example of the shoe shiner. So in 1950s, if Beauvoir had come to the United States, she may have observed someone saying that the black shoe shiner is just a shoe shiner. He is a shoe shiner. He is not a rational being. He's not a full human being. He's not capable of deep intellectual thought because he is a shoe shiner. That's just what he is. But there's a tension here. The fact that blacks were relegated to the margins of society, not to mention the lynchings and mass genocide, the fact that we put certain categories of people into certain roles where we only allow them access to certain activities and relationships in society is not a basis for saying that that's something essential about them. The fact that a black man in 1955 was a shoe shiner doesn't mean that he was essentially just a shoe shiner, any more than a woman is inherently just a woman. The otherizing is mystified. Here we go back to Bartke's description of mystification again. Mystifying the actions, the events, the relations that other women, that other blacks, that other gays, that other lesbians, that other trans persons, that other intersex persons, that other persons with disabilities. This is a kind of becoming. It's not something that is inherent in certain persons. This is something that happens within a social milieu. There's a tension here. We play a role in our oppression because we internalize our otherness. It's part of our identity formation. On the other hand, we don't play a role in our tension because there are limitations and barriers that keep us from transcending the situation in which we find ourselves. So Beauvoir asks, should this state of affairs continue? What is it to be human? We need a conception of public good that assures the private good of the citizen. Saying you can't do some activity because you're a woman, or you can't do some activity because you're black, or you can't do some activity because you're disabled, doesn't work. Abstract equality does not work. Every subject strives for a mode of transcendence, to become more than the options they've been given. And people should be allowed to take part in activities that allow them to transcend, to engage in freely chosen projects, to be a subject, a self-constituting subject. So, for Beauvoir, the problem of women is a problem of liberty. It's a problem of freedom. There's a conflict between the self as essential and compulsions of a situation in which she is inessential. Reactionary measures are problematic, and we often look at women like they are not making their own choices due to the double bind. In the same way that we might have looked at the shoe shiner and perceived him as inferior, comes back to the fact that he did not have choices. His choices were limited. He was in a double bind because of racism in the US culture at that time. So the question might be whether or not we can both be a self and an other reciprocally in an environment in which othering is neutralized, without hindering the possibilities of others, of other others, of other subjects. Here you have the introduction to the second sex, where Beauvoir is trying to make us see, help us to see, that one is not born a woman, but rather one becomes a woman. There are a series of systematic actions, relations, otherings, which we internalize, that go to the core of our very being, that we fail to adequately challenge, that keep us in a secondary, inferior, submissive role to men in this society. So on Beauvoir's view, gender oppression then requires women learning how to change their ontological reality, their ontological existence, to change who we are as subjects. Right? And so we'll be thinking about this question quite a bit throughout this course. Who am I? What is it to be a subject? What is it to be a self? Well, Beauvoir's saying, well, if you're a woman in this society, what it is to be a self is not looking too great. There are limits in place preventing us from becoming the selves that we would choose to be. Our identities are not self-constituted. We are not capable of being the creative, transcendent beings that we would like to be. And over the course of the next several weeks, we'll talk about some of the particular reasons why that's the case. And we'll talk about what we might need to do to find a way to exercise our self-actualization, to exercise choices and decisions that we think would make us the kind of beings that we want to be. But we might wonder whether Beauvoir's solution is a good one. Basically, Beauvoir is saying, do you want out of gender oppression? Do you want to mitigate gender oppression? Then become a subject. Transcend your oppression. How does one just transcend their oppression if the oppression is coming from, to a large degree, from outside oneself? This continues to be a major tension in feminist theory, gender theory, disability theory, queer theory, trans studies. There's this tension about the interior and the exterior. How do I make my life better? How do I mitigate the kinds of oppressions that I suffer if those oppressions are not things that I personally have control of, if they're structural oppressions? So we'll be looking at some other ways of thinking about these kinds of questions.